Sometimes I wish I was a teacher because I started out as a teacher in a secondary school, in an open prison, in a diocesan college, and actually in a vocational school for a short while as well. Well, I loved it. I was teaching English and religion. And with the religion classes, I never did any. There was a book, I think, that we were supposed to go through, but because religion wasn't on the leaving certificate, I didn't feel any pressure. And I used to sit at the top of the class and I would tell people stories, the students. And then they would ask me, I'd tell them about maybe, my first girlfriend or something. And I would ramble on. It was like a podcast. And I found it a great dynamic for teaching through sharing. I was only sharing my story. And that's all I've been doing as a writer for 40 years. It's just sharing my story. And because, I've always felt that religion was the key to identity, to who I am as a person, that my relationship with other people, my relationship with the environment around me, it can't be contained in ideas that are secular or that are like materialistic. I can't contain my understanding of my love for my mother based on psychological processes. And that's, I suppose, in a way why I'm kind of uneasy with psychology. I mean, psychology has become the way to speak truth. And yet, if you stand back from it, it's also a kind of a metaphorical language, but a lot of it just doesn't mean anything sometimes. Do you know what I mean? It's like, because we agree the language means something, so it means something. People might say, I'm feeling uncomfortable with what you're saying. And I don't know what that means, really. Or I'm emotionally this, that, or the other. And I don't know what that means. It's like there's no ground to the things that we say to each other with psychology. And I always noticed when I was writing plays, they had a phrase for bad stuff in a play. Bad stuff in a play was what they called psychobabble. When you had two characters on stage and they're saying things like, you shouldn't have said that to me. Well, I'm angry, that's why I said it. Yes, but it hurt me. I felt uneasy when you said it. That is kind of psychobabble. It's you get it in soap operas on the telly as well. But on the stage, they used to say, when they'd be trying to teach you how to write a good play, don't be using psychobabble. Always use images. There was a great poet who won the Nobel Prize one time, and his name was Derek Walcott. He was from the Caribbean. And I had the huge privilege of meeting him one time in Paris. And we talked, and he was enthusing about how when you write a play, if you write poetry, if you write sentences that are poetic, the audience loves it. The audience warms to it. The audience listens to the play. So you have a character, instead of standing there with maybe the wife at the table in the moonlight and having this late night argument, and he's saying, well, well, I don't feel you should have done that. Well, I did it because I need to express myself and because I am, all the psychobabble language. And people go asleep, the audience goes asleep. But supposing the same two characters, they're in the kitchen, it's late at night, you're watching it on the stage, and he says to her, look at the moon. It's full tonight. And then she goes to the window to look at the moon. That's very watchable, because they're speaking in a language of metaphor. And there are some great playwrights whose dialogue in the play is always full of images. And it's a beautiful way to share the deepest level of who the character is. That was Derek Walcott told me that. And I would have related that to my own sense of religious faith, because I never saw religion as institutional alone. And I never saw that my faith in Christ was about belonging to the institution. What I saw was that when I tried to make sense of my own human experience, me being in the world, me suffering depression, let's say. I had an extreme bout of depression about 2011. It lasted for about 2 years. And I went to a therapist at that time. For about 3 years I went to the therapist each winter. And it was very helpful. And I'd always encourage somebody who is suffering from depression to go to a therapist. Because it can be very, very healing to talk out your anxiety and your fear. Mind you, you can get the wrong therapist who has an ideological view or who has a particular commitment or overcommitment to one kind of school of therapy. And then they can in some way unconsciously force your narrative into their context and then give you back their context as a language for you to understand yourself. And I'm not so sure how you get over that problem, but that's for professionals who are scholarly in psychotherapy to figure it out. But what I found was that therapy was very, very helpful, but it didn't quite catch who I was. And I knew that I had this problem from earlier because when I was growing up, I was always melancholic. I wrote poems as a teenager, always talking about a kind of a melancholic feeling I had about the world. And I loved listening to Chopin. Chopin's music just touches me with its tender melancholy. And I actually loved a lot of violin music by people like Brahms, and especially the late quartets of Beethoven, because they too would bring me down to a place inside myself where I felt comfortable, because it was the music was resonating exactly in the vibration and in the mood that was at my heart. I was a very melancholic person. And because of that, even from an early age, I had bouts, periods of time where I would go through a kind of a blackness. And one of them was when I was about a year from being ordained a priest, and I had this blackness came over me. And it came as a sense of, and it always does come as a sense of inadequacy about something, right? That's a really interesting thing for me about how depression, the blanket of depression, can land on you. It's like snow. I often think that depression is like snow. Do you know the way snow covers the entire land? And it just happens overnight, and it happens mysteriously. And you wake up the next morning and it's like the whole earth is covered in snow. And sometimes feeling depressed, for me, feels like that. And then it comes always, like snow comes, do you know the way the first few flakes fall out of the sky on an evening in winter? And you just barely notice them in the sky above you. Is that snow falling, you think? And sure enough it is. Well, I always used to feel that depression always came through one single chink. The first little flakes were when you started to say to yourself, I'm inadequate. And it might be an inadequacy in a relationship. You know, I was young, I'm in my 20s, and the main thing was to try and form a partnership with another human being. And so often I failed. And so often I might go to the dance and then I'd be too intimidated to engage with the woman, or I might engage with her at a superficial level where I would be performing, I'd be just like, I'd be out there performing a kind of a sense of self, but inside I'd be completely lacking confidence. And then the moment would come where I'd love to get to know her better, or invite her to, come home with me, or go for a walk. And I wouldn't, because I'd be afraid, and it would be just that moment. I'd know in that moment, I'm inadequate. I'd look around me, I'd see other young lads, and they'd be, full of bravura, and they'd be able to seduce socially just for fun in the dance. They'd be, getting on well with the women, coming and going, and I'd feel inadequate. And that's sometimes it's like the first snow flakes falling, the first way that the whole big blanket of depression can come on somebody is through inadequacy. And it could be social, like like I'm saying in that when I was young, but it was also academically. I'd feel not as good as the other person in the class. It was also jobs. I'd feel somebody had it doesn't matter what it is. In fact, inadequacy is a delusional condition anyway, because nobody is inadequate. Everybody is complete in themselves, and they're having their own unique, singular life. But inadequacy and when I came to a year before my ordination, I felt this overwhelming sense of inadequacy, and I went away then to do a retreat for about 10 days. And at that time, the kind of retreat that I was doing was more like an intense 10-day therapy session, because each day it was like what they called a guided retreat, and you had a Jesuit director, and you would meet him once a day, and it was really therapy. I mean, you would talk about your life and your anxieties, and then you'd go away and think about it for 12 24 hours and come back to him. I can't stop. I love this. I love the sound of the bell. So I'm going to let it ring out. It's 11 o'clock in the morning here on Friday morning. It's midsummer, but it's like a day in September here in Donegal. It's still a lovely day, and there's brightness until 10 o'clock tonight, or 10:30. And there's me clock. Do you know I was away for 3 days? No, I was away since Sunday, that's 4 or 5 days. I was on Tory Island, learning Irish. I was doing a course on Tory Island. And I came back here to the house, and there was nobody in it while I was away, and I came back and I opened the door, and as I opened the door, I was in the corridor putting in my bags out of the car, and the clock chimed. It just happened to be on the hour of 6, and it was like the clock was welcoming me home. I really enjoyed it, because it's a wind-up clock, you see, which is really, it makes all the difference. There's something very ritualistic about winding the clock. You put in this little key in 3 places and you wind it. So it's like you're kind of calling forth the energy of the clock to mark out the time. And it always, like all bells do, it has a sense of otherness, a sense that the bell is alerting you to a transcendent dimension. A metaphysical dimension, a dimension in time that you don't notice. And it does it just by marking time. It's quite a beautiful thing, the clock, and I'm very fond of it. Now, I was talking about that year before I was ordained, and I went away and I did a retreat, and the retreat was quite intense, and it was like therapy. And what welled up in me at that time was a ferocious sense of inadequacy in relation to going forward and being an ordained minister. It was like, I suppose, do you know the bit in the gospel where somebody says to Jesus, "Lord, I am not worthy"? And that's a good position to have when, you know, you're going to Mass, going to receive the Eucharist. Lord, I am not worthy. And it's a lovely position to have, even, you know, just as you're going out for a nice day. And it's a beautiful day. Let's say it's today. Let's say this is a kind of like, feels like September to some extent, but they say it's going to brighten up in the afternoon. Now, I'll go for a walk on the beach, and that will be a lovely moment. But like in a moment like that, it's really lovely to say, "Lord, I am not worthy," because it's like saying that the ocean in front of you, the walk that you're having, the health in your body, it's all like a gift. It's all like somebody's given you this as a gift, and there's a kind of a graciousness about feeling, I'm not worthy of this goodness. I'm not. Otherwise, you take everything for granted, which is like the beginning of arrogance, you know. You take your beautiful health for granted. You take your family for granted. It's like, oh yeah, they're there. But to think about them as a gift, to think about even the day when you're walking along the country road or, you know, through the streets of a town. Lord, I am not worthy. Thank you, Lord, for this wonderful, beautiful moment. And that's an attitude that if you take it at a secular level, it can sort of cause you to implode, and it caused me to implode on that particular week or 10 days where I was doing a fairly intense grilling psychologically of my inner life. And so I didn't actually go forward. I pulled out of the whole enterprise for about a year. And then I went back to it, and then I got ordained. Because I'd finally realized that the way the Christian gospel expressed a story, like a poetry, like a narrative of images, was a safer foundation for me than psychology or psychological analysis. And so when I finally was ordained about a year later, and I was asked, as everybody is, to just, take a motto, take a phrase that you will use as your motto for life. The one I took was per tenebras ad lucem, through darkness towards the light. And I felt it was a lovely expression of, the story when Jesus is on the cross and he's dying and he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? I thought, that as an image hits the spot with me. With the sense of when you can feel smothered by negativity, when you can feel smothered by despair and no hope, when you can feel a sense of isolation, that you're just not connected to anyone, your friends, your lovers, your family, your children, or your parents, you're just so alone. And then worse, that there is no love at the deep center of your own being. There's just an empty hole inside you. Whatever should be there, like making your life feel that it is the life of God. It doesn't show itself, and that's depression. So it's the loss of God in some sense. That's the kind of language that worked for me rather than psychotherapy. The poetry of, the Godhead, the transcendent Father of all, manifesting in a human being, and then that person abandoned, ending up crucified, ending up in despair. And yet, in that moment, the insight and the experience that his followers had was that he was lifted up by God, he was resurrected, and in his body returned to life. A faith that is contrary to all the laws of physics and logic that we know, or that they knew at that time. And yet it was the only way to express the fundamentally defiant idea that God is completely with us, like a Father who loves us and who is present inside us, in our hearts. So it's per tenebras, through the shadows, per tenebras ad lucem, through the shadows towards the light. You might think that you go towards the light when you go into brightness, when you go into the open air, when you go into the sky. But no, The motto is, through shadows, you will go to the light. Through darkness, you will find the light. Through the cross, through suffering, you will find resurrection. And I think one of the terribly important values about belief in full bodily resurrection of Jesus is that you're not in any way saying that the light comes by modifying the darkness. It's not a light that is, well, I'll deal with myself emotionally and I'll feel better. There's a sense of something coming from outside. If there is resurrection, it's like, well, if there's resurrection, then there is a God, isn't there? It's like that would be simple idea. So the template of that idea, you begin to apply to yourself. That what makes me whole and happy and at peace, what makes me free from the shadows, is a light that comes from elsewhere, and yet it is within me. But it's not me grappling with the darkness. It's not me working through the darkness and giving it a context whereby I can then live with it or live beyond it. It's a belief that when in the darkness there is a light of otherness, of transcendence that carries us. And I had a lovely experience of how to describe this recently. Last Sunday, in fact, I was watching on YouTube Mass from Nairobi, from a university in Kenya, in Nairobi. And there was a priest giving a sermon. And I'd watched him before. He's a young man, and he speaks with such eloquence that I would strongly recommend, if you want to take pleasure in a Sunday Mass on YouTube, check him out. I didn't mean to mention him, so I don't have the details in front of me, but he was Father Bernard, or Father Victor. Those two of them, I forget which one he was. Nairobi Mass Live Sunday. And put that into Google and you'll probably find him. But he said a beautiful thing, he was talking about how, the phrase he used was this. He says sometimes God is absent from your life, but he said he's always working in the background. And that's the way to think about it. And then he gave an example, a simple image. There's a cathedral, apparently, in Nairobi that he says Mass in, and the electricity is created by a generator. But every 20 minutes or 30 minutes, the generator has to click on and off. And so there's a 30-second gap. So he might be in the middle of a sermon, and the microphone will go dead all of a sudden. But he said he doesn't worry, because he knows it'll come back on in 30 seconds. If you were in the middle of a sermon and you thought it was very eloquent what you were saying, and suddenly somebody turns off the mic, you'd be kind of completely distressed. It's a frightening experience. I've had it myself on stage when you'd be, using a kind of a microphone with a headset run by a battery, and all of a sudden it goes dead and you're standing there in front of 200 people. It's very scary because suddenly they can't hear you. But he said that in those moments when that happens in the cathedral and the microphone goes dead, you just wait. You just go silent, you wait. Because you know that in 30 seconds, the generator is doing what it has to do, clicking on and then off. And the microphone will come back on in about 30 seconds. And he said that's the kind of confidence that you need to take as an image when you're in dark times, when it feels like all of a sudden your life is falling apart. The great thing is God is working in the background. I thought that was a very beautiful thing, that it helped me from the very first day that I got that phrase, per tenebras ad lucem, and I made it my motto, and that was in 1981. And I actually got it, it was accidentally. I was chatting to a nurse, and she was a beautiful woman. Like at that stage I had totally committed that I was going to be a minister, an ordained minister. So, I found it very hard to cope with that now. I don't think I ever coped properly with it, because I always felt I need a woman, I need a beloved partner to guide me, help me, and to share my life with. Anyway, that worked out well for me in the end. But there was this moment, I'm looking into the beautiful eyes of this beautiful woman who happens to be a nurse, and she's wearing her nurse's uniform, and she has a little badge from whatever, teaching hospital that she had trained in England, and there was writing in Latin on it. And I said, can I look at the brooch? What's the words? And there they were, per tenebras ad lucem, through the shadows into the light. And I thought, that is such a treasure to have found that phrase, that motto, because that's exactly what I want. That's exactly the words I want to keep with me for the rest of my life, as the way to insulate me against depression, or even to live through depression, or even to live through whatever troubles come in life, because they do come, like you get depression, some people get financial disasters, some people get health disasters. Like at the end of the day, I'm 70, and my comrades, people my age, they're beginning to fall. They're beginning to drop. And it's no panic. It doesn't mean that we can't all hope for another 10 years when we're 70. But the older you get, there's no doubt that you have this almost kind of more, you get more serene, to be honest with you, about how quickly life passes. And what becomes hugely crucial in that is that you're able to think of your life in terms of an image. For me, it's an image rather than a psychological statement. I don't need psychology to name what I am. I don't use psychological language to describe who I am. I don't believe psychological language touches the fundamental ontological foundation of what it is to be human. The only thing that does is poetry. And in that sense, for me, religion is poetry. And the religion that comes from Abraham down through that lineage in Judaism and completes itself in the sacramental nature of the life of Jesus. That to me is it. That's the poem. That's the complete poem of life. And it's, I wish, as I said in the beginning, I wish I was a teacher. And I don't mean just being in the classroom like I was. I don't mean just sharing my story. But sometimes you see a teacher who's a master of what they have studied, and they are an authority. And if I was an authority on theology or Christianity or Buddhism, I'd be able to say to you, look, here's the whole insight into faith. And I'd sometimes, when I'd start to do a podcast, I'd be wishing I knew more than I do. Honest to God. Sometimes I come to this microphone with a sense of embarrassment, a sense of inadequacy, a sense that I don't know much. And then I fall back on the idea of poetry and the idea of just sharing my story. And that my story, I've a compulsion to tell it the same way as when I was a teacher and I would sit in the class, way back in the 1980s, 81. And I'd sit there in the front of the class at a religion class, and instead of going through the book, I would just tell stories. And so that's what I do. You know, when I write books, when I write stories in the Irish Times, I'm just sharing who I am. And even though sometimes I wish I was a teacher, I also find that if you share your story, there's some hidden way that, like, let's say you're in the room telling your story to your children, or your child, let's say one person, one-to-one, a daughter or a son, and you're sitting there having a coffee, and you're talking to them and you're telling them stories about your life. There's very few people who do that without realizing that it's a brilliant and wonderful thing to do. Anybody who sits down, you sit down with an old person, you know, you sit down with Granny, or you sit down with your mother, or you sit down with your father, or you sit down with your children. Anybody who sits down for a mug of tea on a one-to-one and starts to share your story, you will know how amazing it is. It's like there's a third person in the room. It's like the story comes through you. You're just bearing witness to what happened, let's say. Might be a young person telling their parent about an adventure they've had, a romantic adventure, and they're just telling the story. Or it might be the older person who's talking, the parent, and let's say they're just talking about their memories when they were young. And I know that if you ever draw an old person out, if you want, you know, if you're sitting there talking to somebody who's over 80, it's not difficult to have an amazingly good time with them, because all you have to do is forget about the health questions and forget about how many tablets are you on and can you walk to the toilet. Just ask them what they did when they were young. And there's 1,000 versions of that question. And their eyes will light up, because people love to remember. And when somebody starts sharing their story, as I say, it's like there's 3 people in the room, because it's like the truth is being shared, and the truth seems to have it's like a presence of its own. And that's why I tell stories. So yes, I'd love to be a teacher. Yes, I'd love to be an authority on theology or Buddhism. And I have been looking at Lamrim teachings because I did in this month gone by in June. I've been going back a little bit, if you notice in the podcasts, to the beautiful and eloquent ideas in the Lamrim teachings of Tibetan Buddhism, what they call the swift path. All done, brought together, synopsized and put into singularly clear language by the great Tsongkhapa in the 15th century. So I've been touching on that because it's in my heart at the moment. I've been using little Buddhist practices again because I find them very enriching, and I think that they're like a structure, they're like a scaffolding that holds my Christian faith intact. You know, it's as if the core light is Christ at the center as a presence, and then Buddhist practices like, you know, devotional practice, guru yoga, meditation, rituals of you know, candles and bells and all sorts of stuff. They become a scaffolding around that Christ at the center, in the imaginal realm, in the realm of the mind. And by mind I mean the heart, because the mind in Buddhism is where your heart is. When you bring someone to mind in Buddhist practice, you know, if I bring to mind my mother, I can feel the energy coming out of my rib cage as a light going out in love towards her. It's like Tai Chi. And those are practices which are just so close to the kind of frame of Christian faith. And they're not they're not a revealed religion. So there's nothing in Buddhism which is telling you anything different about God than Christianity tells you. It's telling you about how to train your mind. That's all that Tibetan Buddhism is about. How to train your mind into a state of samadhi or calm abiding or stillness. So you can do that and use little Tibetan or Buddhist practices as a scaffolding for what is at the center, the light, the Christ, the Theotokos, the Mother of God. So the more I go on in life, the more I feel these two are so beautifully connected, Tibetan Buddhism and Christianity. And I also feel that I can never read the gospel without reading it within the context of Jewish faith, which is in itself a complete jewel, unique in the whole history of the world. That insight that there is one God, the God of Abraham, ever present, and in all sorts of unexpected places. So I'll just finish, if you don't mind, with a little taste of my storytelling as I do it in the Irish Times. And this would be from, about the beginning of May. Yeah, beginning of May, maybe middle of June. So it's not that long ago I wrote this. But it's just to close this and to say that probably for July, I wait for the bell. Probably for July, I will be singing my enthusiasm for lots of little Tibetan ideas about how to pray and how to bring your mind into a focus whereby you can experience the mentor deity that is your guru deity, the God, whoever, whatever that is. For me, it would be Christ. You bring that into a focus in your mind. And you use Tibetan insights and wisdom and skill to get there. It's no different from what happened in the early church, where they used quite a lot of Greek philosophy to contextualize the light of Christ. The Greek philosophers had evolved powerful ideas which the early Christians were very happy to use as a scaffolding to make some sort of sense, or to explain or talk about the experience they were having of the risen Christ. Although no Greek philosophy and no Tibetan philosophy can do any better than the eloquence of the poetry. The poetry is that Christ is risen. The truth is that Christ is risen. But for each context, for each generation, there needs to be a retelling of it. And if I was a teacher, if I was a professor, I might be able to do it with some coherence. And as you know, I don't. I just tell stories, because that's all I am, a storyteller, sharing my story with you, hoping that sometimes it'll inspire you too to share your story with others around you. And I suppose hoping that in that dynamic, when you're talking to people, when you're using sometimes psychological language, which is good, and you're using the language of therapy, which is good, you're using your own skill and wisdom at whatever you have learned in life, which is good, and you're using all those languages to share your story, share your memories with people. I'm also hoping that you'll find a space inside which is like your faith, which is like, might be your Christ, or it might be the mentor deity of whatever religion you follow. It doesn't matter. But that the one like a poetic center of being, the one who is your God, teaches you compassion, and is just like the real teacher inside you, teaching you in every moment how to find bliss, even in moments of darkness. Even in moments of darkness, how to find the light by resting all your trust in Him or her, Mary, Christ, or whoever is the mentor deity in your heart. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.